Hey, what's going on, guys? Mike here. Today we are setting up what I think is going to end up being a pretty sweet aquarium. You can kind of see it here in the background. We won't show too much of it right now, but it's a little different. It's something that I've been kind of thinking about doing for a while. We decided to just go for it. It was a really fun project, but it was also extremely frustrating at the same time. I don't think my patience has ever been tested this much in a project ever. But anyway, guys, let's go back in time a little bit and let's check out the setup so far of this tank. While I deconstruct the tank here, guys, let's talk about this aquarium because you haven't seen it in a long time. It was one of my favorite tanks, and obviously we're rescaping it here, so let's talk about what happened. This tank has been set up for about a year, and that's, one of my longer tanks that we have here at the new house. That's about the time that we've been here for. The scape was filled with mosses, lots of other epiphytes, some dwarf hair grass, and we eventually put some stems of different Rotala species in the background. We had very little problems with algae for a long time, and it was only until, I want to say probably 7 months into its life cycle, I then made a little bit of a mistake. And that was floating a bunch of plants in here that had come from Florida. I can't remember what scape we were doing, but I had a bunch of leftover stem plants and maybe some others, and I let them float in this aquarium. I needed a place for them to hang out for a while, and I just left them in there for too long. What that did was it introduced a bunch of problems. So we ended up with some bladderwort, this nuisance plant, and then a bunch of nuisance algae came along with those plants. And so as soon as that really started to happen, I was already thinking that I was going to do a rescape on this tank, so I just kind of left it. And unfortunately, it's taken me this long, so this tank has looked like this for a long time, and it's definitely time to change it. Once we have the fish out and the tank completely deconstructed, now it's time to check out our substrate. So as I siphon the water out of the tank, I tried to clean up the substrate as much as possible. I actually forgot that when we set this tank up initially, we added in some substrate lifts. So that's what you see, these nylon bags here. They're filled up with lava rocks, and that just helps us not have to use as much substrate to get the height that we want. But because this tank is a year old, I do want to add some more substrate. That'll help to kind of rejuvenate it a little bit, if you will, and give us that height. Once I have the substrate kind of mapped out to the slopes that I want to have, now we need to put some rocks in this thing and start playing around. For this scape, like the one before it, we are going to be using black lava rock. I have a ton of this stuff, a lot of smaller pieces I think we're going to use in this scape, so I just kind of start by putting them in the tank. And I know that I want to do a stacked rock aquascape, almost like a Stonehenge theme, but not exactly, a little bit more organic. Balancing these rocks on top of each other is a huge pain in the neck, okay? It is very zen, and it is extremely satisfying when you get these rocks balanced right and stacked up, but it just absolutely drives me off the deep end when I accidentally bump the tank and they all fall down. To eventually hold these rocks in place, we will use some gel type super glue and some other stuff that we'll talk about in a little bit. But, before I start gluing rocks together, I want to get an overall feel of how the scape's going to look. I don't want anything to be permanent as I'm doing it right there in the moment. So after several hours of stacking rocks, accidentally bumping them over, and having to do it over again, this is what I came up with. Now that I'm happy with the layout so far, we will be adding in a few more structures a little bit later on. I want to start super gluing, because if I don't, then I'm just going to keep having the same problems. I'm going to keep knocking these over. So we go in here with the gel type super glue, and we just do our best to hit all the points that connect. As I'm doing this, I'm knocking stuff over. I'm losing my mind at this point. I tried using some epoxy. I went and looked for some water-weld putty to help kind of fit the grooves of the rocks and have them be more stable. But the stuff that I had was expired. I was trying to get this done, and so I went upstairs and I ended up grabbing this bottle of polyurethane foam. It's meant for pond use. It creates a nice bond. It fills in gaps, and so I thought it might be worth a shot to try it on this tank. So we used that in a few areas, kind of down at the lower levels of the rock, where there was a lot of big gaps and I needed the most stability. This stuff is kind of difficult to work with. This is my first time really using it on a scape, and I didn't do the best job, but I feel like I still managed to get it in the right spots. I tried to be as clean with it as possible and not smear this stuff all over the rocks, but a few accidents happened here and there, and we're just gonna have to deal with it. We can always conceal this stuff up later with plants and moss and stuff like that, so it shouldn't be too big of a deal. Coming out to the tank the next day, things are pretty much solidified in place. There's a few of the structures filters that aren't done yet, but we're just going to go ahead and start planting now because we are going to be doing a dry start on this tank, guys, due to the plants that we're going to use. So here I'm just wetting the tank down in preparation for the plants, getting the substrate nice and soaked. So now let's get to the plants, guys. What are we going to be using that's making me want to do a dry start? The main plant and the main reason for doing this is because we're going to be doing dwarf baby tears. And I hope we have enough here. We can always get some more later. We have a bunch of tissue cultures of this dwarf baby tears as well as some dwarf hair grass. And this all came from the same eBay seller that I've been getting at least the hair grass from a long time. I wanted to try out these dwarf baby tears to see if they were good. And I mean, these tissue cultures are super good condition, guys. I highly recommend this seller. I'll put a link for them down in the description. The dwarf baby tears, as you might know, is a super high-tech plant. It needs a lot of light, a lot of CO2, and we're probably going to be dumping a lot of ferts into this tank. I think doing a dry start method on it is going to help it get established a lot faster rather than if we were to fill this tank up with water and just go for it. And planting this stuff is going to be a lot easier because we don't have to worry about it floating up. These plants have a super shallow root system, and it's difficult to get them to stay down in the substrate where you want them. So this method of the dry start is just really going to help us out here, I think, and it'll be fun to watch this thing grow as a terrarium over the next few weeks. I'm gonna leave most of the rocks bare for now. I think ultimately what we want to do is get a little bit of moss, maybe some Riccardia on these. I'm not sure yet. I want a little bit more time to think about it, but let me know what you guys would do. Would you leave these bare? Would you add some kind of moss? I don't want to go too crazy with epiphytes on these rock structures just because I feel like it might eventually get out of control, a lot of trimming, and ultimately I think it might take away from the look that we're trying to achieve. All we have to do now is cover the top of the tank with some saran wrap to lock in the moisture, and I'm going to come out to this tank probably once a day, maybe once every 2 days, open it up a little bit, get some air exchange going in this thing to help prevent any mold or anything. I don't think we're going to have too much of an issue with that, but you never know. At the same time, I'm also going to be making sure that it's staying really humid in here, spraying it down with the sprayer here. I'm going to change the light to be on for 18 hours a day, full blast. We can totally do that here in this immersed setup, no problems whatsoever. I'm still considering whether or not we're going to do any kind of wood in this tank. I have some of those Sangani roots. That's the really fine, pliable wood that we use to create the vines in the ancient garden tank, and I think it might look cool to add some of those around the rock structures, but I'm just going to let the plants get a footing and then just take one day at a time. As I get inspired to change things, I'll be sure to keep you in the loop. Obviously, the next video that you see on this tank, it'll be us filling it up and probably adding some fish too. In that video, we'll also go over the rest of the equipment that we're going to be using on this tank. We're going to change things up a little bit. Obviously, we have to really be using CO2 on this tank to get the plants to work out. So I'll be sure to cover all of that in a lot more detail in that next video. I'm still thinking of a name for this aquarium, but I'm kind of set on just calling it visitors, right? Because it's kind of like, hey, who stacked these rocks like this? Was it nature? I don't know. I like to think that it was maybe some other being that came down, kind of like the whole Stonehenge, 7 wonders of the world type deal. That's kind of what I'm going with. Let me know what you think of that down in the comments below. So yeah, guys, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new and hit that notification bell so you know when the follow-up video to this one comes out, when we fill it up and probably add some really cool fish to this tank. Thanks again so much for watching, guys, and we'll see you in the next one.